The morning I found out my son had been lying to me for almost 2 years started the same way every other morning did. I woke up before 6, made a pot of coffee strong enough to strip paint off a fence post, and sat at the kitchen table listening to the house settle around me. That old farmhouse in western Pennsylvania had been making the same creaking sounds for 37 years, ever since my wife and I moved in with nothing but a second-hand sofa and enough stubbornness to think we could fix the place up ourselves. We did fix it up. Every floorboard, every window frame, every inch of that house had either my hands or her hands on it at some point. After she passed, the sounds it made started to feel less like noise and more like company. I was 68 years old, retired from 26 years as a civil engineer, and living what most people would probably call a quiet life. I grew tomatoes in the summer. I drove 40 minutes to watch my grandson play Little League on Saturdays. I called my son every Sunday evening, and he always picked up, always sounded happy to hear from me, always said the same thing before hanging up: "Love you, Dad. Take care of yourself." I believed him. That was my first mistake, I suppose, but I don't think it makes me a fool. I think it just makes me a father. My son had moved to Columbus with his wife about 4 years earlier. He worked in commercial real estate, which meant he spent most of his time on the phone and most of his weekends playing golf with clients. His wife was pleasant enough, polished in that way that sometimes makes you feel like you're being managed rather than talked to. She always brought wine when they visited, always complimented the house, always asked about my health in a tone that landed somewhere between genuine concern and someone quietly calculating how much longer an old man might reasonably be expected to live. I told myself I was being uncharitable. People can be warm and strategic at the same time. That's not a crime. What I never told my son, because it didn't seem relevant, was that the house was paid off and had been for 11 years. The land it sat on, about 14 acres, had been appraised 2 years ago at just over $800,000. The area had changed. Young families were moving in, developers were sniffing around, and what had once been an ordinary farmhouse on a country road had quietly become something people called a prime opportunity. My financial advisor, a careful man named Gerald who wore bow ties and kept paper files long after everyone else had gone digital, had suggested more than once that I consider estate planning. I kept putting it off, not because I didn't care about what happened to my assets, but because sitting down to formally arrange what would become of your belongings after you die is the kind of thing you always feel like doing next month. I didn't know my son had not been putting it off at all. It was a Tuesday in early March when everything changed. I had driven into town to pick up a prescription and, on the way back, decided to stop at Harlan's Hardware because I needed a new set of drill bits, and Harlan's always had a better selection than the big box store out on Route 30. The law firm where my son had referred me 2 years ago for a minor property question, Mercer and Associates, was 3 doors down from Harlan's, tucked between a dry cleaner and a small insurance office. I had parked in the lot shared by all 4 businesses and was walking toward the hardware store when I saw my son's car. I recognized it immediately. He drove a dark green SUV with a dent on the rear passenger door from a parking garage incident he'd told me about last Thanksgiving. I stopped walking. I stood there in the cold with my hands in my coat pockets, and for a moment I thought, well, maybe he's in town and just didn't mention it. Maybe he was going to surprise me. Maybe he had some business nearby and planned to call when he was done. I stood there and talked myself through 4 or 5 reasonable explanations before I noticed the second car parked beside his, which I also recognized. His wife drove a white sedan with a custom plate I'd always thought was a bit much. It was parked right next to him. They were both here. Neither of them had called to say they were in town. I did not go into Harlan's Hardware. I stood in the parking lot for another minute, feeling something I couldn't quite name, not alarm yet, just a quiet wrongness, like a note played slightly flat in a familiar song. Then I walked to the glass door of Mercer and Associates and opened it. The reception area was small and smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner. A young woman at the front desk looked up and smiled. Before she could say anything, I heard my son's voice from behind the closed door of one of the offices down the short hallway. He was laughing at something. His wife said something I couldn't make out, and then a third voice, calm, professional, said, "We just need the two of you to initial here, and then sign at the bottom." I said to the receptionist, "My name is Arthur Calloway. I believe my son is here." Her expression shifted in a way that told me everything before anyone said a single word. It was the look of someone who has just realized they are standing at the edge of something they don't want to be part of. "Mr. Calloway," she said carefully, "do you have an appointment?" "No," I said. "I don't." The door at the end of the hallway opened. My son stepped out first, and when he saw me, the color left his face so completely and so quickly that, for a second, I thought he might actually be sick. His wife appeared behind him. She went very still. The attorney, a man in his 50s with silver hair and a handshake he clearly used as a first line of defense, came out behind them and said, with the practiced calm of someone trying to manage a situation, "Mr. Calloway, perhaps we could schedule a time to—" "What are you signing?" I said. I was not shouting. I want to be clear about that. My voice was completely level. I had spent 26 years in rooms full of engineers and project managers and city officials who all thought they were the most important person present, and I had learned a long time ago that a quiet voice in a tense room carries further than a loud one. "What are my son and his wife signing in your office?" Nobody answered. My son looked at his wife. His wife looked at the floor. I asked again. The attorney said, "This is a confidential client matter, Mr. Is my name on any document in that office?" I said. I looked directly at him when I said it. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. What I eventually learned, not that afternoon, because no one in that office was going to volunteer information freely, but over the following days through my own attorney, a sharp woman named Diane, who specialized in elder law and did not suffer nonsense quietly, was that my son had initiated a process to transfer the property deed of my home and land into a trust that named his wife as the primary beneficiary. The paperwork framed it as a family estate planning measure taken on behalf of the property owner. My name appeared on the documents in a signature line I had never seen, let alone signed. Diane's first call when I brought her the initial information was to ask me directly, had I ever signed any document authorizing my son to act on my behalf regarding the property. Had I granted him power of attorney? I had not. The explanation my son eventually gave, over the phone 3 days later in a conversation I recorded with Diane's advice and a small device she lent me, was that he had been trying to protect the asset from potential estate taxes, that he had meant to bring it up but hadn't found the right moment, and that his wife had only been listed for legal reasons, not because she had any real claim. He used the word transparency 4 times in 20 minutes, which is usually a sign that the opposite has been occurring. He said he was sorry I had found out this way. He did not say he was sorry for what he had done. I did not sleep well for about a week. I won't pretend otherwise. There is a specific kind of grief that comes from discovering that someone you love has been looking at you and seeing, not a person, but a balance sheet. I sat in my kitchen at odd hours, drinking coffee I didn't need, looking at the walls my wife and I had painted together, and trying to understand how the little boy who used to fall asleep on my chest watching baseball on Sunday afternoons had grown into a man who was capable of forging a process to take my home without asking me. What I kept coming back to was not anger, exactly. Though anger was certainly there, it was something more like clarity. The questions my son had been asking over the past 2 years suddenly reordered themselves in my mind. The casual mentions of the property value, the gentle suggestions that the house was a lot to maintain at my age, the one time his wife had asked, over dinner, whether I had ever thought about simplifying things. I had taken all of those as ordinary conversation. I understood now that they had been reconnaissance. I also understood that the attorney had a problem. Mercer and Associates had allowed a process to advance that involved documentation with questions about its authorization. Whether they had known about this or simply failed to ask the right questions, Diane could not say initially, but she made clear that the firm's exposure was significant either way. Within 2 weeks of my visit to that office, I received a phone call from the attorney himself, very composed, very measured, suggesting that a resolution might be possible that would serve everyone's interests and avoid unnecessary legal proceedings. He mentioned a figure. It was, in absolute terms, a large number. In relative terms, compared to what my home and land were worth, compared to what I had built over 4 decades, it was an insult dressed up as generosity. I told him I would be in touch. I called Diane and told her what he had offered. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Arthur, that offer exists because they are worried. Don't let them stop worrying." We did not take the settlement. What followed was, to be honest, exhausting in the way that any sustained institutional conflict is exhausting. There is nothing glamorous about it. It is phone calls and document requests and waiting rooms and more phone calls. My son, once it became clear I was not going to quietly accept the payment and make the whole thing go away, stopped calling on Sunday evenings. His wife sent one text message, through my son's phone, that said they had only ever wanted what was best for the family. I read it twice and then set my phone face down on the counter and went outside to check on my tomato seedlings, which were coming in early that year and needed to be thinned. My neighbor, a retired school teacher named Walt, who had lived next door for 22 years, came by during one of those weeks with a casserole his wife had made and no particular agenda other than being present. He sat with me at the kitchen table for 2 hours. He didn't try to offer solutions or tell me what I should have done differently. He mostly just listened, which was more valuable than anything else anyone did for me during that time. When he left, he stopped at the door and said, "You know, Arthur, the only people who try to move quietly around property they don't own are the ones who already know they have no right to it." I thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. The investigation that Diane initiated revealed that the documentation process had involved a notarization that did not hold up under scrutiny. The notary, a woman who worked out of a small office across town, had no record of my appearance because I had never appeared. When pressed, she provided a story that changed in its details between the first and second telling. The state licensing board opened a separate inquiry. The attorney at Mercer and Associates retained his own counsel. Everything slowed down in that way that legal matters slow down, where weeks become months and each development generates 3 new questions. I kept living my life. I drove to see my grandson's games on Saturdays. I made coffee at 6 in the morning. I fixed a section of fence on the east side of the property that had been bothering me since the previous fall. There is something grounding about physical work when everything around you is abstract and procedural depositions and filings and emails with words like alleged and purported and without prejudice. Driving a fence post into cold ground is honest in a way that nothing else is during a time like that. My son reached out in late May through a letter, not a phone call. It was typed, not handwritten, which told me something. It ran to 3 pages and covered a lot of ground. His financial pressures, the debt they had accumulated, his wife's anxiety about their future, his belief that I would have agreed to the arrangement eventually if approached correctly, and his regret that things had reached this point. He wrote that he loved me and that he had convinced himself, somehow, that what he was doing was a form of planning rather than a form of taking. He wrote that he understood if I couldn't forgive him, but that he hoped, someday, I might be willing to try. I read the letter several times. I kept it in the drawer beside the kitchen table where I keep things I haven't decided what to do with yet. What the legal process ultimately produced, after 7 months, was a formal finding that the documentation had been improperly initiated, that my property deed remained entirely and unambiguously in my name, and that the notarization was invalid. The attorney at Mercer and Associates settled with the state bar and received a formal censure. The notary lost her license. My son and his wife faced civil liability proceedings that Diane pursued separately, which resulted in a consent agreement, not a criminal conviction, though the distinction felt thin to me that required them to pay legal costs and placed a formal legal record of the matter in their name. Several people, when I described this to them, said it wasn't enough. A neighbor down the road said he should have gone to jail. Walt's wife said the wife should have faced more. I understood the feeling. There is something deeply unsatisfying about a legal outcome that is, technically, a win but doesn't feel like justice in any visceral sense. My son was not incarcerated. He was financially damaged and legally documented, and his professional reputation in his industry was quietly, permanently affected. I was told that 2 business contacts of his had heard about the matter and distanced themselves, but he was free to go home every night to the same life he had always had. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about what I actually wanted from all of it, now that the machinery had finished running. I didn't want my son in prison, if I am being completely honest with myself. I didn't want to see him destroyed. What I had wanted from the moment I walked into that law office and watched the color drain from his face was for him to understand, truly and irreversibly understand, what he had been willing to do to me. Whether the legal outcome accomplished that, I couldn't say. I don't have access to what goes on inside another person. What I do know is what I did with my own house. I had Gerald come by in late autumn with the paperwork I had been putting off for years. We sat at the same kitchen table with coffee and went through it properly, a clear, documented estate plan with specific designations, witnessed and notarized by people I had met in person and verified myself. I allocated a portion of the property value to a scholarship fund at the engineering school where I had gotten my degree. I set aside a specific portion for my grandson, held in trust until he was 25. I made clear, in writing, exactly what I wanted and why, and I signed every document myself in front of witnesses who were present in the same room. Gerald, who had been doing this work for 30 years and had seen most things, looked up from the final page and said, "You know, most people wait until something pushes them into this conversation." I said, "I got pushed." He nodded. He didn't ask for details. When the last signature was done and the folder was closed, I walked him to the door and stood on the porch for a while after his car disappeared down the road. The afternoon light was doing what it does in Pennsylvania in November, going golden and low across the fields, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look considered, like someone arranged them deliberately. The old oak at the edge of the property cast a shadow across the gravel drive that I had watched shift and change for nearly 4 decades. My wife had loved that tree. She used to say it looked different in every season and the same in every season at the same time, which was one of those things she said that I didn't fully understand until years after she was gone. I changed the locks on the house in December, all of them, front and back. I know that sounds like a small thing, but it wasn't. It was the first time in 37 years I had done it, and doing it felt like something, not a closing, exactly, more like a clarifying. The house was mine. It had always been mine and my wife's, built into something with our own hands, and it would go where I directed it to go on my terms and nobody else's. My son's letter was still in the kitchen drawer at Christmas. I hadn't answered it. I hadn't thrown it away either. I wasn't sure yet which of those things I would eventually do. Some decisions don't benefit from being rushed, and this was one of them. I had learned, in the course of this year, that I was capable of patience. I hadn't known I had the patience to sit with something unresolved, to let it be what it was without forcing it into a shape that was more comfortable. My grandson called me on Christmas morning. He was 7, and he had gotten a telescope, and he was extremely focused on telling me everything he had already learned about Saturn. I sat in my kitchen with my coffee and listened to him explain planetary rings with the absolute authority of a 7-year-old who had been reading about something for 48 hours. When he finally paused, I said, "You know, when your grandmother and I first moved into this house, there was no light pollution out here. You could see everything on a clear night." He said, "Can I come look sometime, Grandpa?" I said, "Anytime you want." After we hung up, I sat for a while in the quiet of the kitchen. The house made its familiar sounds around me. The clock on the wall ticked. The furnace clicked on and ran its cycle and clicked off again. Outside, the fields were winter brown and frost-covered and entirely still. I was 68 years old, and I had built something worth protecting, and I had protected it. That wasn't a small thing. In fact, standing there in the kitchen my wife and I had shared for all those years, listening to the house settle into the cold morning, it felt like just about everything.